I want you to imagine for a second that you have chronic, debilitating anxiety. Obviously, you're going to want to get that checked out or go to some place, get some kind of treatment, right? So you go to a doctor, you think he's going to take care of you, you fill out some paperwork, check yourself in for a quick test. Next thing you know, you're in a drug induced coma for months. And when you finally wake up, your brain is essentially scrambled to the point where you don't even know how to speak properly. I know it kind of sounds wild, but that was pretty much the reality for like hundreds of patients who went to Dr. Cameron for help and ended up getting semi-illegal experiments done on them. The term illegal is really pushed to its limits when the CIA is involved, but we'll get to that. This video is going to serve as a sort of prelude to a longer MK Ultra deep dive video that I want to do around November. October is nearly over, but I still want to try and get one-ish Halloween themed video, or maybe just something, I don't know, creepy, I guess, but probably won't, but it's worth at least pretending to try, but we'll see. Dr. Cameron has a pretty weird history prior to working under MK Ultra sub Project 68, and that's not really our focus, but I want to quickly go over it because it does play a pretty big role in understanding the kind of person that he was going into the project and kind of why the things he did in the project he did. I guess that's a way to put it. So he was born in Scotland and got his bachelor's degree in psychological medicine from the University of Glasgow in 1924. It's degree number 1. He got a doctorate of podiatrics from the University of London in 1925, degree number 2, and a doctorate from the University of Glasgow again in 1936. So it's degree number 3. And that alone should tell you that he was really dedicated to psychology. But what I think is the first inkling that his dedication would sort of spiral down into what he eventually ended up doing for MK Ultra can be found in his book Objective and Experimental Psychiatry, which stated his belief that psychology should be studied in the same fashion as biology, which I'm not sure if you're very, very well with how psychology is studied now, but that's not really the way you like. Yeah, there's some basics there, but you really do not want to be doing it that way. And Cameron was a big proponent of clinical psychology and the scientific method. So again, the book itself doesn't stand out too much unless you see where this line of thinking would lead him down. Because at the time, it was a little weird, but it was pretty normal for what other people were writing at the time. There are weird things he did do between 1936 and 1945, like develop this idea that mental illnesses were diseases that were hardwired into our bodies and could be remedied like any other disease, and passed this line of thinking onto the students he taught at the Albany Medical College and the Russell Sage School of Nursing. And I think the only reason this wasn't really a major red flag as it would be now is because not many people were informed on psychology at the time. But regardless, in 1945, he would be part of the I'm going to butcher this, but he was part of the Nuremberg trials. I really am going to butcher this every time I say it, but the Nuremberg trials were essentially the court trials after World War II that were meant to assign punishes to Nazis and stuff. And I wouldn't really blame you for not knowing what they are, since they're not the most interesting part of World War II, interesting in quotes. And they really just boil down to X evil person is assigned to X years in prison, or you have to give this information for that. It's a lot of that, pretty much. However, what's really important about the trials for us is that Dr. Cameron was invited to give psychiatric evaluation of Robert Hayes. Again, Hayes is not the important person to us right now, but more so Cameron's view on Germans. Before the Nuremberg trials, he wrote the Social Reorganization of Germany, in which he basically says that German culture, and by proxy Germans, would need to be reformed and altered after the war because their culture requires them to need an authority figure to lead them or to rule over them, something like that, and that if nothing is done about them, they'll eventually become a major issue for world peace in the next 30 years. Now, to be fair, a lot of psychiatrists at the time wrote a bunch of essays and books like that about Germans. Just, that was the time. After that, he wrote Nuremberg and its Significance, which essentially said the same thing, except he noted that Germans had a higher chance of aggression and were more likely to commit atrocities, sorry, due to their past and their psychological nature. And he suggested that if they were shown the crimes they committed during World War I and II, they would never do it again. And again, this is a very, very small inkling of what he would eventually start doing later and what his experiments pretty much revolved around, which was just trying to retroactively change people's minds or brainwash them in a sense. Nuremberg is important to Cameron's story because he was already starting to form these drastic opinions on psychology and psychiatry and mental health, and being part of the trial seemed to just bolster, like it just made them stronger, I guess. And these feelings on Germans started to spread to society as a whole pretty much. He felt that psychiatrists and other behavioral scientists had to act as sort of social planners for the world to separate the weak from the strong. The weak being anyone who was mentally ill or not happy with the state of the world, and he viewed them as weak because they couldn't properly cope with life, and it was the duty of the strong to isolate them so they wouldn't influence the next generation. It's important to note that he also had a massive fear that nuclear weapons would fall into the wrong hands, i.e., the weak's hands. And so this philosophy was sort of driven by his own fears of what would happen to the world in the next few decades. A lot of fear mongering, which again, at the time, there was tons of fear mongering after World War II. You see a lot of that after tragedies and wars like that. And so he basically wanted to stop tragedies by removing the weak from society because he felt they were the reason for World War One and Two. In the early 1950s, he started to delve really, really deep into the ideas he was starting to develop, like I said before, and he even started to disregard the Freudian unconscious, which was the clinical method for evaluating mental illness at the time. And he saw mental illness as literally contagious the way any other illness was, and went so far as to say it was also generational, and that if a bloodline had a recurrence of mental illness, then it was the duty again of the strong to eliminate these carriers for the sake of society. So the police, teachers, government, hospitals, schools, clinics would all need to use the correct strategy. I use quotes a lot, but use the correct strategy to stop people from getting infected with mental illness. And Cameron was very unhinged with these ideas because he even believed that any contact with someone with mental illness was contagious. And when I say any, I really do mean any type of contact, even if it was indirect. And to show you just how insane his views were on that, I want to give you a bit of an example on how he saw you, on a way he saw you could get mental illness. Let's say you're on a date and you two go to a movie. I know it came out years ago, but for the sake of the example, let's just pretend you go to see Infinity War. So everything's going great. You guys buy some popcorn and icy, maybe some candy if you're into that. And the movie's going to start soon, and you just finished buttering your popcorn, so you rush to your theater, you sit down in your seats and just relax to enjoy a movie. And then Iron Man shows up on screen, bam. Now you are infected with anxiety, because if, in this example, if Robert Downey Jr. has anxiety, now both you and your date have been infected with anxiety. And then when you leave and say thank you to the guy who cleans the floors, the ushers, now you have infected them with anxiety. And it sounds really dumb because it is, but that's just how he viewed mental illness. That's the way he saw it. Again, pretty much just like the common flu. Dr. Cameron, the insane man that he was already conducting psychological experiments when he caught the attention of the CIA. They were interested in him because of his sensory deprivation studies, which is basically just denying someone of one or more of their senses and seeing what happens, like putting them in a tank and denying them sight and seeing what happens, putting them in a tank and denying them sight and hearing and pretty much seeing what happens. It's pretty much a lot of that. And it's a lot deeper, but that's pretty much just the gist. But Cameron's sensory deprivation studies lasted up to 35 days, which, keep in mind, his contemporaries only got up to 6 or 8. So he was really pushing these patients to their limits. And the only reason he got these results was because he would use drugs and hypnosis in order to put them in a clinical coma of sorts. And Dr. Cameron, the insane man that he was, would then compare the subject's psychological breakdowns to that of criminals who broke down while being interrogated, and really just let that sink in. He was basically just drugging people out and seeing if, when he broke them down, they reacted the same way criminals do, which I'll let you come to your own conclusions about that. Dr. Cameron was mainly interested in schizophrenia and how to cure it, and his strategy was to figure out how to just straight up erase people's memories. And that again is sort of what we got our inkling of when he was talking about showing the Germans the atrocities they committed in World War One and Two, and using that to affect their minds. They're not exactly the same, but you could see how that line of thinking would take you to point A to point B. And so, because MK Ultra was basically all about brainwashing and psychological torture, I'm sure Cameron fit right in with all the people working on the project when he eventually gets invited, but we're not there just yet. In 1953, Cameron would develop the theory of psychic driving. Psychic driving was basically an experiment where the mind of the patient, or more like victim if we're being honest, was manipulated by using verbal cues that would be played on repeat in order to drag any repressed thoughts or memories to the forefront of their mind. And yeah, that's pretty much what it did. And he did distinguish between two types of cues he used during these experiments. One being auto psychic driving, which is when recordings of the patient were played as the trigger. So basically, them saying the thing that would trigger their schizophrenia. And then heteropsychic driving, which is when the person doing the experiment spoke the cues instead of the person being experimented on. Vaguely the same, but different effects, I assume. An example of what this looked like is an experiment he ran on a 40-year-old woman. There's no name, even if there was, I wouldn't give it, but that's neither here nor there. But basically, she was forced to listen to herself repeat a cue that was originally told to her by her mom and was a big trigger for her mental illness. The cue that would trigger her was, if you don't keep quiet, I'm going to leave you behind. And so the woman listened to that 45 times on repeat and was basically begging him to stop. She was shaking, hyperventilating, turning straight red from stress. Even after they stopped, she still kept shaking. But their fucked up shit they didn't always just stop there, because they didn't always just use the recording and would have one of the experimenters repeat the cue to her for 10 to 12 hours, separate from the time when she was having it be repeated to her through recording. And they even had experimenters continue to do this to her in her sleep. During the entire time these things are happening to her, she's already been put into a clinical coma with, I'm gonna butcher this name, sodium ammobarbital, which is pretty much just a strong sedative. A lot of the chemicals I do name are pretty much just strong sedatives. But anyway, they used it so that their psychic driving sessions could last almost 20 hours a day, and that was done for 10 to 15 days. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that this is just one woman who was part of a way larger study. So just imagine this is not only happening to her, this is happening to 10, 15, maybe even 20 people at once. So that's like the level of what we're doing here. So these studies were not really tiny and, done just to one person. One thing I wanted to note is that while I couldn't find any evidence of it being used in this study or any conclusive evidence of what study it was used in, Cameron was very interested in using a colleague named Dr. Hebb's psychological isolation technique, where they would put a patient in a dark room with no sound and their eyes covered in order to disrupt their sense of self during experiments. And again, I couldn't find which ones Cameron used this technique in, if he used it at all, but it did catch his interest because he wrote that in an essay somewhere. Cameron claimed that the entire purpose of these experiments was therapeutic reorganization and basically just trying to find a way to give the patient better mental fortitude after the experiments were done, or after the treatment was done, I should say. However, this wasn't really the case for most of his patients, and instead they were basically just brainwashed. He even wrote in a paper that after his experiments were done, in one specific study, only one patient showed any signs of trauma from the treatment, which had to just be a straight up lie, considering a lot of them suffered a variety of effects afterward and more than likely left with more trauma than they walked in with. And one of his patients, who managed to come out kind of okay, even described the experience, basically might as well just say experiment though, but she basically described it by saying, "It made me nervous all over again. Everything hurt me all over as it did before. My voice sounds like I'm going to die," which that does not sound like she left with better mental fortitude, so I have no idea what he was talking about in that paper. Despite all these treatments essentially just being psychological torture, the CIA probably loved them because in January of 1957, Cameron's experiments were subsidized by them and he was now working under MK Ultra Subproject 68. There is some contentious information about whether he knew he was working under them or he just genuinely believed he was working under the pseudonym of the people that they used to fund him. You can go either way. I'm going to just choose to believe he knew it was them because it feels like it wouldn't have mattered anyway, whether he did or not. I feel like he would have been doing the same exact experiments even if he knew, but that's up to you to decide. However, throughout his time working under MK Ultra, he would be given about 69,000, which was obviously hidden as funding received from an organization called the Society for the Investigation for Human Ecology. Just as a side note, I feel like if you have to hide the fact that you're giving someone money under a pseudonym, you're probably doing something evil. That's just how I feel about it, but regardless, with his new MK Ultra money and I assume an extra goal given to him by whoever hired him, Dr. Cameron intensified his experiments and started to mix electroshock therapy into them. And what came from that was depatterning. And what came from that was depatterning, which he claimed would reduce the patient's mind to an infertile-like state so they'd be reconfigured to the wishes of the experimenter, which again sounds extremely evil, but whatever. The process to depatterning was the same psychic driving techniques he used, except they were combined with chloropromazine, which is again basically a sedative. And after that is where the electroshock therapy was used to complete the depatterning process. And while doing this, he found that there was 3 stages of depatterning that would happen. In stage 1, the patient still had some memory loss, but was still pretty aware of things going on around them and remembered people and names and things like that. However, in stage 2, there was significant loss in spatial awareness and they would often ask where they were, how they even got there, and they started to lose a lot of their sense of self and had pretty big trouble with motor skills. And in stage 3, they were cured of their schizophrenia, but they were pretty much just a walking blank slate, basically just a vessel that could move at the point that you wanted them to, I guess. Now, Dr. Cameron was sort of correct about how his method cured them of schizophrenia, but he also failed to mention that it also wiped any automation from them and left them as husks of their former selves. But I think what's the craziest thing about all of that is that he might not even have been right about his method curing people of schizophrenia anyway, because around the same time, chloropromazine was discovered as an effective treatment for manic behavior, meaning that was most likely the thing that cured his patients of schizophrenia. Nothing else he did was probably part of it. After their treatment, he did keep a close eye on them to make sure things were progressing the way he had hoped. And this phase was called the phase of rehabilitation, pretty standard, I guess. And in this phase, he would have them closely monitored by a caregiver to make sure that no schizophrenia symptoms came back. And if unfortunately they did, their electroshock therapy would be intensified, which probably sucked. And he kept that going for about a month, and then after that, he would send them home. They weren't fully safe though from him, since he would have them do frequent follow-up visits for more electroshock therapy. And the idea for this was for them to slowly become more stable, and he was very proud of the fact that most of them did not show any bad reactions from having to return and do that for him, which no shit they're not going to. You program them to be okay with being there, but again, whatever. For the few that were paranoid about coming back, he pretty much just readmitted them to the treatment, which again, sucks. Dr. Cameron kept these experiments, hidden as treatments, going for many years after that and eventually widened his scope. He started to study more varieties of psychoneurotic people, mainly people with anxiety, OCD, and other minor health issues like anger issues or depression and things like that. And he essentially did the same treatment to them, which the CIA continued to fund under their pseudonym. What I do find funny is that Cameron apparently did not like his treatments being referred to as regressive shock therapy, despite that literally being what they are. And he didn't like this because he felt it was implying that his treatment was an actual functional return to infancy, which again, it literally was. But he preferred to think of it as a partial similarity in behavior. Those are the words he used to describe both those things. They kind of just mean the same shit, though, to be honest. I couldn't really find any conclusive evidence or articles about when he stopped running his experiments and treatments or when he stopped working under MK Ultra in general, but my assumption would be that it all ended either when he retired or when MK Ultra was shut down. It could really go either way. Regardless though, he was a pretty insane man and did a lot of terrible things to people. That's about it though. Like I said, this is mainly just to be a prelude for a longer video on MK Ultra. I just found the Dr. Cameron stuff a little more interesting and kind of felt like it warranted its own video just because I didn't want to do all of this in the longer MK Ultra video, and I also didn't want to not give it the time I felt it deserved for to talk about it and really tell what happened to these people. So again, that video is probably going to come out in November. I've been really busy, so the video grind has not been very good lately, but I'm going to try to get another one out soon. We'll see. I am also probably going to switch to a Saturday upload now just to see if that works out better, but that's about it. Thanks for watching.